welcome the audience on YouTube. This is an event hosted by Construction-Vision-Forum and supported by British Embassy Seoul, UK's commitment to carbon neutrality in construction sector. We have two great panelists today. Jonathan Woodland, he is head of climate diplomacy at British Embassy Seoul, and he's going to present about the UK government's commitment to the carbon neutrality in building sector. I have another guest, James Hooper, who is Principal Sustainability Consultant at Mott MacDonald. So he consults on private projects targeting carbon neutrality and decarbonization. So he's going to bring us some of the perspectives from the private sector as well. So before we start with the events, let me actually introduce to the podium Mr. Jonathan Woodland. Again, please welcome. Thank you.
So firstly, delighted to be invited by Brian Coe and the Construction Vision Forum to this panel discussion. The British Embassy Seoul is delighted to be hosting this today. I'm going to talk about the building sector and how it figures into the UK's 2050 net zero target, but also our nationally determined contribution. The first thing to say is that the UK's approach to delivering net zero is very well developed. We were the first major economy to legislate major emissions reductions over 15 years ago, and we were the first major economy to legislate 2050 net zero back in 2019. Since 1990, which was our emissions peak, we've reduced our emissions by around 50% in total. Our 2030 emissions target is a reduction of 68% of those emissions, and that's set out within our NDC. Part of the reason we've achieved this level of reduction is because of our highly developed governance. We have a UK Climate Change Committee which provides advice to Parliament about the government's work in delivering net zero. They provide recommendations, analysis, which is firmly in line with the science, which says we have to have emissions reductions firmly in line with keeping 1.5 degrees Celsius within reach. So I can't really emphasize that enough. It's science driving policy, driving decision making. So there is a lot of scrutiny, and that's why our targets are very stretching. There is probably no more challenging decarbonisation sector for the UK than the building sector. In Korea, I hear many times that the industrial sector is the fundamental sector for which Korea really has to tackle in order to get to net zero. In the UK, it's buildings. And part of the reason we have a real challenge within the building sector is because we have many, many millions of homes which are very, very beautiful, like those in the slide here, but which are hundreds of years old and extremely inefficient. So firstly, a snapshot of the UK building sector. There are approximately 30 million buildings in the UK. 1.7 million are non-domestic properties, so the likes of commercial, industrial, public buildings, but 28 million are households. A few characteristics which are, I think, worthy to point out. 21% of households in the UK are flats and apartments, and that's actually very different to Korea, where probably around 80% are flats and apartments. Average UK homes on average are probably a little bit bigger than in Korea, so around 150 square meters for your average detached house. And we have relatively lower population density than in Korea. So our kind of most populated and biggest urban areas, somewhere like Greater London, probably half the population density. I'm going to point those factors out for a number of reasons, because they do impact a nation's decarbonisation strategy in this sector. Give some examples. Building size will impact which heat solution will be the most effective and the scale of the energy efficiency savings on offer. Location and proximity to other houses will also have an impact. For example, it is obviously more cost effective to convert the heating source of an entire apartment block than it would be to decarbonise each dwelling individually. While solutions such as heat networks are very likely to be suitable only in areas of really high population density areas. So, and this is, sorry, I'm going to have to, can I stop there and just start again? So while solutions such as heat networks are very likely to be suitable for higher population density areas because of efficiency and in order to recoup high capital costs. Another useful bit of context is the kind of ownership categories, and I've set these out in the slides. So 64% of our homes are owner-occupied, 90% private rented, 17% are social housing, and 1% are publicly owned buildings. Incentives for decarbonising each of these different categories are going to be very different, and that all adds up to a very complex set of policies which need to be brought together in order to decarbonise the sector. A bit more on the UK building landscape. Our homes are typically very old, and as a result have much lower efficiency. Another challenging factor in the UK with our historic homes is that hundreds of thousands of UK households are what we call listed for protection, precisely because of their historic value. This means consent must be applied for in order to make any changes to the property that could affect its special interest. So in numbers, the UK's historic building stock looks like the following. 1 in 6 homes in England built before 1900. 46% of homes in England built between 1930 and 1982. 5% of homes in England built in the last decade. And when the government has a target of about 300,000 new homes built per year. To state the obvious, there are quite significant differences to Korea when it comes to the age of the UK's housing stock. So as I open this discussion, the UK has a well-developed approach to policy setting to achieve our emissions reductions targets. We have an economy-wide net zero strategy covering all emission sectors. This is underpinned by a range of sectoral strategies, so for power, for transport, for land use and more. The heat and building strategy, which comes to 244 pages, is the net zero strategy for the UK's building sector. It demonstrates the policy and regulatory interventions that the UK is implementing or considering to implement to cover the very broad and very challenging building sector. The UK starting point is that the transition to net zero is the single biggest economic opportunity of the 21st century. We see the transition to low carbon buildings, for example, supporting maybe 175,000 skilled green jobs by 2030. The strategy brings together the full picture of funding schemes, whether it's the home upgrade scheme, the social decarbonisation fund, the boiler upgrade scheme, the green heat network fund, brings all this together into a package of funding which comes together to about £6 billion in order to deliver major strides forward in emissions reduction this decade. And it also explains regulatory interventions such as minimum energy efficiency standards and the role of energy performance certificates, which we'll discuss later. It's worth now digging into some of the detail of the emissions problem that the UK is trying to solve via the policy and via the heat and building strategy. Decarbonising the building sector is extremely important for the UK. As you can see from the chart, buildings account for somewhere in the region of 30% of our overall emissions as of 2019. And of those 30% of building emissions, about 23% come as a result of our requirement to heat our homes. To break that down a little bit, and to kind of give a bit more of a sense of why this is a real challenge, the chart here illustrates England's huge reliance on gas central heating, somewhere around 86%. We are actually significantly behind many other European countries, such as Norway, Germany, who have gone much further and much faster on electric heat pumps than we have already. As the slide shows, even as of 2021, gas boilers still significantly outsell electric heat pumps in the UK. So there's a lot to change in order to really decarbonise our housing stock at the moment. Turning to inefficiency. In addition to transitioning from fossil fuels in our homes, we also have to find a way to make our homes much more efficient. Compared to peers in Western Europe, our old, poorly insulated housing stock experiences significantly higher temperature loss than countries such as Norway, such as Germany. So a number of real problems to solve. There's a question in this, I think, about the role for government. We can, I'm sure, debate that over a discussion slightly later. The UK's recent record on home insulation is actually quite poor, and something we need to kind of put up front as a really big issue. This wasn't always the case, though. As you can see from the chart, back in 2012, we had a peak year for insulation improvements in the UK. But from 2013 onwards, government cut support for insulation improvements, and as a result, installation rates fell by around 90%. Whilst the UK's tried to resurrect home insulation improvements since 2013, successive policies have not solved the problem. The view of many would be there's just insufficient funding in order to incentivise people to insulate their homes. In order to deliver net zero, we now need to resurrect government support for home insulation to the levels last seen in 2012. So this is quite an important chart, I think, because in many ways it shows the key role for government in driving net zero, not only in providing market signals, but in also providing financial incentives for people to take the right kind of action on energy efficiency. It's worth putting all of this into a bigger context. We can't look at the building sector completely in isolation. So shifting now to the wider picture, let's start with power. In 2012, the UK was reliant on coal to meet 40% of its electricity needs. In 2022, this fell to less than 2%, as the UK rolled out around 13 gigawatts of offshore wind, which in 2022 provided as much as 26% of UK electricity. By 2030, we expect to have as much as 50 gigawatts of offshore wind connected, so a huge amount of low carbon, clean energy. Power sector decarbonisation for the UK has been one of our kind of low-hanging fruits, a relatively easy sector to decarbonise, and as a result is going to account for a very, very high percentage of the 68% emissions reductions we're aiming to achieve via our NDC by 2030. The stat in the bottom corner indicates for the power sector, by the time we get to 2035, we'll have reduced maybe between about 81 to 86% of our total emissions. It's quite a contrast, though, if we look at the building sector. Progress here has been much slower. As a result, the precision of some of our forecasts are much less refined. So by 2035, the building sector, according to net zero delivery pathways, are expected to reduce emissions from the UK's NDC baseline by only around 47 to 62%. The comparatively large scale afforded to the building sector is because of the real challenge for the UK in this space. We need to bring together a combination of increased efficiency, low carbon heating, more efficient energy, using products to help deliver net zero. And that's before we even get to issues such as addressing embodied emissions in the construction sector. On the efficiency side, we've had a few successes. Some of them are going back a few years now. But just to give a bit of a sense of kind of where we've achieved progress to date, we've got, from 2008, we've increased the number of houses with double glazed windows from about 70% to 88%. So still a bit of space and scope for improvement. And we now have around 14.3 million homes, so roughly 50% of total residential properties in the UK with cavity wall insulation. So probably a number of steps we can go to improve that. Part of the reason, and coming back to the heating sector, part of the reason crucial efforts to encourage adoption of electric heat pumps are only slowly getting underway is because of our focus in driving decarbonisation in the power sector. After all, there's very little value or only minimal value in using electric heat pumps if we don't have huge amounts of low carbon electricity ready. We do, from around now, and we will do increasingly over the next decade, especially as we get to 50 gigawatts of low carbon, 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030. And as the economy electrifies, whether it's EVs, heat pumps, these will require vast amounts of electricity, possibly doubling demand by 2050. So we need huge amounts of low carbon and zero carbon electricity here. The power sector is critical to enable sectors such as transport, buildings, and others to take the huge strides that are now required in order to deliver net zero. I want to turn now to a couple of key regulatory tools which are seen as critical in assisting the UK in meeting its emissions reduction targets. We need to say up front, there's no single perfect level of energy performance that is appropriate for all buildings. There are various ways to measure energy efficiency, but the UK favours the Energy Performance Certificate, known as EPCs. To run through the background briefly, introduced in England and Wales in 2007, EPCs have a rating from A to G, and this reflects how efficient a building is. A, at one end, is very efficient, G is very inefficient. This covers how much it costs to heat and power, and also things like likely greenhouse gas emissions as a result. Not all homes in England and Wales currently have ratings. They're only required when a dwelling is constructed, sold, or let. The government is committed to upgrading as many homes as possible to achieve EPC Band C by 2035 in line with our emissions targets. What does EPC C mean in real terms? Homes with EPC C ratings typically mean they've been built using energy efficient building materials. They have floor, roof, walls and loft insulation, an energy heating system, double glazing, low energy lighting. The UK is looking at the type of support, funding and otherwise, it can provide, acknowledging that there'll be a large proportion of our building stock where it's simply not feasible, affordable or cost effective to make upgrades to EPCC at the moment. So this is a major challenge. We probably estimate somewhere in the region of 60% of homes would not currently meet EPCC. So there's a huge amount of work which needs to be done to bring up the whole housing stock to a level consistent with our decarbonisation strategies. Turning now to minimum energy efficiency standards. We've briefly explained EPCs, so it's worth just unpacking what the kind of minimums are we're looking at and some of the approach here as part of a package of regulatory interventions. From 2025, we have a future home and building strategy. So this will mandate all new buildings will be built in line with the requirements of securing an EPC rating of at least C. With new buildings fitted with low carbon heat sources and high standards of energy efficiency, this will probably remove any need for any later retrofitting. So making sure we get the new houses that we're building in the right space as soon as they're built is a really big priority. We're also looking at the industrial sector. We're requiring privately rented commercial buildings to secure a minimum energy efficiency standard of EPC-B by 2030. So EPC-B being a very high level of efficiency. We're looking at new performance-based energy ratings for large commercial and industrial buildings. So these are spaces which are over 1,000 square metres in size total. And we're looking at a new standard in order to help decarbonise a sector which is currently really inefficient and really energy intensive. Earlier in the presentation, I mentioned the ownership of the UK housing stock and emphasised it's quite varied. So just to reiterate, 64% owner-occupied, 19% private rented, 17% social housing, and 1% public-owned buildings. Minimum energy efficiency standards were brought in to improve the efficiency of private rented properties specifically. So this is around 19% of the housing stock. Governments, despite what some people might think, do generally think very hard about whether there is a requirement for a policy intervention in this type of space. In the case of MEES, minimum energy efficiency standards, we did see this type of intervention as proportionate, because an estimated 4 out of 5 people who own homes, and this was based on surveys, were not yet ready to consider making any energy efficiency improvements, believing that their actual current property was already energy efficient. And this was in many cases despite contradictory evidence which suggested the opposite. So we've intervened in part because the market, homeowners weren't seeing the need to take the action we thought was necessary. Turning now to a bit more of the breakdown. So a fairly large number of UK privately rented properties with EPC ratings of F and G. Sorry, let me start that again. So turning now to the breakdown, as the chart shows here, there is a fairly large number of UK privately rented properties with EPC ratings of F and G. So there is a real case to focus on bringing these homes up to speed, up to date, in line with MEES. Right now, there is actually a bit of an evolution of MEES, some of which is in legislation and some of which is being considered. So whilst the current standard for newly rented properties is to have an EPC of E, we're actually considering whether we should bring this up to C, which, as you could see from the chart, would make a significant difference across that part of that housing sector. But again, reverting back to the total home ownership breakdown in the UK, rented properties, 19%, make up only a fairly small percentage of the UK housing stock. 64% of UK homes, as we've said a few times, are owner-occupied. And at present, there is no requirement for an owner-occupier to have an EPC. This situation, though, is almost certainly going to change. Referring to earlier comments about the role of the UK Climate Change Committee, the committee have strongly recommended, in line with scientific evidence, that to achieve statutory emissions reductions, we must have the majority of housing achieving an EPC by C. So the EPC of C by 2035. So a new set of rules which will cover all different categories of ownership. So this is going to be a big change. What we are seeing is early data which is beginning to demonstrate the value of this type of investment in energy. Let me start again. What we, however, are seeing is early data which is beginning to demonstrate the value of this type of investment in energy efficiency. Knight Frank, one of the UK's largest realtors, estimate that moving from a D to a C in terms of EPC categories is adding 3% to housing value over and above local house price growth. So the market is recognising that there is value in more energy efficient homes. I think as one thing I would suggest is as more homes increase their energy efficiency, increase their EPC rating, the likelihood is we'll see even more compelling evidence over the coming years for this type of investment. And now turning to kind of my final slide. We can't look at decarbonisation within the building sector purely in isolation. The last year's energy security crisis, which was, let's recall, was predominantly a gas crisis, has been a wake-up call for many of us. The UK has done a very good job of increasing its deployment of clean energy in response to the crisis, but we haven't probably done enough in order to reduce demand. Doubling down on energy efficiency will be a massive asset to energy security. It has been estimated that retrofitting all of our poorly performing homes, those with an EPC of C or less, could reduce gas imports by as much as 15%. And whilst I've said already that one of the challenges of home efficiency is the high upfront costs, I do think in the last 12 months the business case has changed dramatically for doing more on energy efficiency. And I think the chart here is extremely revealing because firstly it demonstrates the huge difference in energy bills between the most and least efficient homes. But it also demonstrates how energy bills have doubled for most homes since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, with the least efficient homes now paying a whopping £5,000 annually just on energy. So the investment case, given these huge annual costs, the investment case for really investing in energy efficiency is now looking all the more compelling. So I'll stop there and thank you.
Well, thank you again for this presentation, John Woodland. And we're going to have a short break for our panel discussion setup. So we'll be back soon. Thank you very much. Welcome back. So we're going to start our panel discussion. Now I just brought up Mr. James Hooper. So we're going to hear from these two panelists. Again, like John from more like a government perspective, and from James from the private sector as well. So let me start with John. So your presentation showed a lot of government's commitments, especially emphasizing the housing sector. And you briefly mentioned about owner-owned homes, the house owners, how they're going to react, and one of the studies showed like 3% added value to the house if you increase from D to C. But however, when the government introduces these kind of restrictions, a lot of times you hear their resistance to those because added costs and I don't have money and all kinds of those things. So other than that added value study, which is like uncountable at that point. So how does the government actually enforce this to the private sector owners? And do they have some offer incentives, something like that?
Right, thanks very much for that. An important question, because I think this is ultimately going to come down to the economic case for making this type of improvement. I think one thing to say before we turn to the monetary side of things. 10,000 people die every year in cold homes in the UK. This is a factor which is known. So I think there is an awareness that actually energy efficiency is probably a space where we need to invest because it's for a social good. Turning to the more monetary, economic side of the debate though, because I appreciate this is going to be a significant factor. I think in terms of delivering the full suite of energy efficiency improvements, which the average home is likely to require, some people say it could cost within the region of about £25,000 a year. That's a huge source. That's a huge amount of money. One of the challenges is that in some of our least efficient homes are actually owned by some of our population, the least affluent wealth groups. So the poorest living in the least efficient homes. So there's not only a responsibility for government in order to set new standards, we need to find ways to help people to meet them. So a bit of this is working with the financial sector. So one of our biggest mortgage lenders at the moment in the West is actively providing more generous terms to potential buyers of homes who are looking for more efficient properties. What other levers can we provide? And this is where I think it's a big role for government in working with the financial sector in order to guide the right type of financial instruments to help not only new buyers, but also help those who are really going to struggle with the upfront costs of making the energy efficiency measures required. So that's part of that. And the second part would be around education. I think what we've seen in the last 12 months since the energy crisis, I think the average literacy of what it takes to drive energy efficiency in the homes is not as high as perhaps we might want. I think it's probably fair to say in Korea, where electricity prices have been so low for so long, energy efficiency has never really been on the agenda. I think probably a similar thing is true in the UK. And as a result, people don't necessarily understand what interventions are required. So at the level of whether we turn off lights or whether we don't overboil water, I think there's a genuine lack of understanding about what that means in energy efficiency terms. In terms of more the retrofitting existing properties, I think there's also a big education piece that government and local authorities need to do in order to explain, whether it's via citizens advice bureaus or other information services, what actually homeowners need to do, what innovation is required, and where they can actually tap into the resource, building expertise in order to deliver those things. So, yeah, the government can't just regulate and leave it as a problem for homeowners. There's got to be a much broader package of support.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, that's a good point that the Korean industry also has to listen to this, because it's not just the government who can achieve this. It's got to be a collaboration among all aspects of the industry, including financial sector, as well as professionals and others. So, James, since you're a professional, let me jump into the private sector, non-residential, because according to the numbers that John provided, only 1.7 million out of 30 million is non-residential in the UK. However, I believe that those buildings are larger buildings than, of course, houses, right? So in terms of the energy density or energy usage, probably it's not 1.7 out of 30, right? So it's a lot more than that. But he said at this point, there's no regulation for the non-housing sector in the UK as stringent as the housing sector. But as a consultant, what do you see in terms of those non-residential building owners, how they react to this carbon neutrality or decarbonization in general?
So I think traditionally we have seen that kind of one of the motives for making a building more efficient has been almost driven by green building codes, which sometimes is, sometimes isn't a kind of a government-driven initiative. Sometimes it's kind of a more not-for-profit or organisation that set up green building codes. So traditionally, it's almost been the prestige of a building rating. And then, I guess more recently, with the advent of ESG rating and so on, there are now, I guess, kind of more expansive ways of comparing, commercial buildings, and particularly from the perspective of investors, because often, these large commercial buildings have investors who invest in the buildings and who build the buildings because they know that there's a good revenue stream coming from them. Because of that, it means that actually there's an increasing interest in what is, the level of sustainability of a building, what is the ESG rating of a building, and obviously a key component of that is the energy efficiency of a given building. And so what we're seeing more and more is that because there is this demand in the market for investors to be investing in green products, and because there is this large stock of commercial buildings which require investment, and there is obviously demand for new commercial buildings, as we see economic growth in many countries, that therefore we're seeing both existing building stock and new commercial building stock having this very strong desire to meet these higher energy efficiency standards and to be able to rate themselves as green buildings, and also highly rated, among ESG ratings, highly rated buildings, because then that allows them access to both, I guess, a broader range of potential funding, but also we're seeing more and more better funding terms as well in terms of lower interest rates.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So it sounds like, you both mentioned the financial institutions' role, right? In Korea right now, as far as I know, this green fund or ESG funds are very limited at this point, provided by the Korean institutions. So hopefully, if any financial institutions are listening to this conversation, they have to understand this importance, how they can play this role in changing this construction industry in this country. Okay, good, great perspective. So let's come back to the regulation again, the MEES regulation. Was there an economic impact analysis of MEES regulations, such as like the construction revenue growth, job creations, and things like that? And if there was, construction companies or the construction industries might benefit from those regulations if they see this is their opportunities for revenue growth or more projects and things like that. So was there like a big picture economical impact study from the MEES regulations?
So there's a big picture set of figures which are available across delivery of the heat and building strategy, and all that will deliver.
Okay.
So that's looking at about 175 1,000 new jobs by 2030, and I think it equates to about £6 billion annually of gross value added to the economy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the high level economic numbers. I mean, in terms of what this means for construction companies, I think the first thing to say is construction is the UK's #1 economic sector.
Okay.
It employs about 3 million people. It's worth about £100 billion to our economy each year.
Oh, wow.
We're absolutely laser focused on ensuring that the UK construction sector not only is able to transition as part of the wider net zero pathway we're taking, but that it's also poised to thrive.
Okay.
I think there's a balance which has to be played. We obviously regulations such as these, I think, provide really useful market signals. I'm not sure we've already got all the package of policy, guidance, regulatory interventions in a place where necessarily the construction sector is absolutely happy at the moment. And I think there's a question here about about the kind of the role of government in providing the market signals. So let's take electric heat pumps, for example. I mean, I spoke about them in my presentation. There's not enough which are being sold at the moment, and I think one of the issues we've had with electric heat pumps over the last 10 years is the government has never provided the kind of regulatory market signal to unlock the kind of investment that's required in that sector. We've got 1.8 million gas boilers which are being sold every year. That's a long-established industry. In order to secure the type of investment required to transition to heat pumps, is going to really require a very, very strong signal. At the moment, we don't actually have a policy which says by X year that electric heat pumps will be mandatory. We do have a policy by 2035 which says there'll be no more sales of gas boilers. I think the reaction from industry at the moment is that actually that's more long-term certainty than was previously had. But actually, if industry was absolutely clear on the pathway for electric heat pumps, we would probably start unlocking the investment. And it's not just the investment required in the manufacture of heat pumps. There's the whole supply chain which sits beneath it.
Yes.
And there's also a massive skills challenge. We have probably 3,000 people at the moment who's thought qualified to fit an electric heat pump in the UK, and that's completely insufficient for the scale of the challenge we're proceeding on. We're probably going to need to double those numbers every year for the next 7-8 years to get to the scale required. So, in terms of the construction sector, I think you could apply this to many economic sectors. If we look at the transition from petrol and diesel cars to electric vehicles, one of the things which I think industry had craved from a long time is a very, very clear trajectory of where we're going. The UK has introduced a 2030 phase-out date for petrol and diesel vehicles. As a result, Jaguar, one of our biggest car manufacturers, announced that they would go all electric from 2025. Certainty generally is the type of thing which I'll defer to my kind of industry colleague to confirm this, but certainty about the long-term certainty about the trajectory we're going is really important. Companies can manage change if they understand the long-term trajectory. So I think overall, how we manage this transition, how the construction sector benefits from it, will require a very clear set of signals, both from government, but also from investors and from other players in the market, that this is the direction of travel. So ultimately, I believe most industries can cope with change.
Yes. Well, you had great points, and you said a lot of great things. Well, one word that I was caught is actually it's a long-term trajectory that's foreseeable for the industry to follow. Right now, the government of Seoul City, as well as the Korean government, they are now establishing this long-term country or either cities carbon emission plan, reduction plan, and they are going to limit the greenhouse gas footprint of each building, and then they set the threshold. And then if you spend more electricity or if you have more carbon footprint than their threshold, then you're going to get fined or you're going to get penalty and things like that. And in order to set those kind of rules, the industry has to be able to look at that as kind of long-term path, not just, they just run into this regulation next year and then they are surprised, right? So I know the city of New York had that like for 10 years to educate the building owners, and then finally the regulation is starting next year. So again, thanks for bringing that up, because again, if you are watching from the government sector, please make sure that you educate the public and everybody and give them enough time, which we don't have right now, because we are approaching 2030 already in 6-7 years. But still, in order to promote that and then bring it together, you have to actually work together with those private sector as well. So again, please give us enough time to adjust ourselves. Okay. All right. So let's move on to again back to your comments. I'm very interested in actually learning more about your financing, and because again, like the Korean financial industry is very primitive in terms of these green funds and ESG funds. A lot of ESG funds go to just renewable energy projects in Korea. So as far as I know, very little building projects get those things. So how did it start in UK, and also what's the you said sustainability or ESG rating is kind of difficult for the financial institutions to rate, but how does that happen in the UK right now?
So I guess for me, maybe my expertise is less how specifically it's happening in the UK, because I guess I work more across Asia and the Asia Pacific region, and just seeing what the drivers are which are enabling these I guess efficiency improvements, and what the push factors are that are pushing large asset owners to want to comply and want to make their buildings more efficient. And so we're seeing that across the world the development of taxonomies which are looking at defining what is sustainable. And this is important because it allows some certainty for investors to have criteria around what's considered to be a sustainable investment and not. So we know that there is a huge demand out there to invest in sustainable products, and we know that therefore some of the large fund managers are looking, okay, we have this money which wants to be put into sustainable products, so therefore how do we assess what can be considered as a sustainable product? And so over the last few years we've seen a huge inflow of cash, but then there's also been some complaints around greenwashing and whether that money is actually being directed to the correct projects. So to give an example, using the EU's taxonomy. So the EU has obviously recently, or not so recently now, but brought in the Sustainable Finance Directive. And as part of that, there's a taxonomy behind it which requires that in order to meet kind of a certain level of sustainability of an investment fund, you have to show that you comply with certain requirements within a taxonomy. And so then because of that, what we're seeing is these large institutional investors are basically coming to us and saying, okay, how can we achieve this? We have to be able to be compliant with this to show to our investors that our fund has products in it which comply with this level of sustainability. How do we then go about making sure that our assets comply with that, so we can classify them as this level of fund, and therefore receive the investment that wants to go to that level of fund? So I guess what we see there is there's a really key role for governments to play in helping to define what sustainability is, because ultimately that has to be part of a conversation with the broader economy, and there has to be input and feedback from across the economy. But really, it's only at the government level that you can provide that kind of certainty and that consistency of what will be considered as sustainable. And so, yeah, I guess that's really, I guess, a key thing that we're seeing is those taxonomies, and being able to rate something as being sustainable or not is really helping to drive investment in. And I guess the key thing is ultimately, and I guess you mentioned renewable energy. Obviously, renewable energy, in one sense, is very easy, right? Okay, well, this is a zero carbon energy generation source, so of course it's green. But the whole point of why we're looking at energy efficiency is because it's kind of the other side of the equation. Mm-hmm. We could build, huge amounts of renewable energy. One of the problems with renewable energy, as we know, is that the generation fluctuates depending on whether it's sunny outside or how much wind is blowing. And so, therefore, in order to cover the total kind of energy demand of a society, you would have to build much more capacity in theory than you would of fossil fuel generation, because you have to account for the fact that there's going to be those fluctuations. So therefore, the way to avoid that and to not kind of overinvest and have wasteful generation is to make sure that you're also on the other side, the demand side of the electricity or energy usage, you're lowering that demand. And so therefore, it's really important to increase building efficiency. And so if you can prove that you are investing in schemes which are going to have a measurable impact in a reduction in energy demand, then that's effectively the same as investing in something which is increasing energy generation. And so that is basically the mechanism by which you can show, and very demonstrably and yes, quantitatively, that there is an investment case in improving energy efficiency.
Yeah. So James mentioned that the government has some key roles in those, basically rating those sustainability in buildings. Especially, funding the project is always happening before the design starts, or sometimes at the early phase of the design, right? So there's no guaranteed performance at that time. So financial institutions has to learn about the building at the design, and then they have to decide the long-term ratings and long-term rates and things like that. So I know there's a BREEAM in UK, and which is Green Building Rating System, but that's not, as far as I know, that's not government-run, code-regulated, right? It's more like it's industry volunteer program. So if you can represent your government, and what would be the best way to enhance this situation, just like James mentioned?
So I think one of the challenges probably within the construction sector is the number of regulations and standards which they need to comply to. Later this year, the UK is considering a public consultation on a number of factors. I think one of the key issues which construction companies face is the range of standards which are out there. I mean, if you're a major player in the construction sector, it's one thing. You can probably have consultants who are looking at kind of whole life cycle emissions, but there's also a real challenge for SMEs here. So I think there's a responsibility for government in order to really work with the industry here. One thing we're going to be doing in the UK later this year is talking about a new consultation on embodied emissions in building products, which is something we've only really touched on here. Well, this is going to be a real challenge. There are no real set standards in this space. The government is going to have to work closely with the building sector to work out what is the most efficient means not only of measuring it, but also enforcing this. So I think there's a role in all of this, and I think it's one that the UK government's acutely aware of. Is that we really need to work closely with industry on standard setting. Now, whether that means kind of changing existing building codes, that's one question. But But I think we probably do need to find a way to how we bring all of this stuff together, so that particularly SMEs, companies which in the transition to net zero could face really quite significant burdens unless there's quite clear guidance on standards. We need to bring all that stuff together and make sure the government is working closely with industry to make sure there's a set of standards that firstly deliver 1.5, but also help companies through the transition.
So just for the audience who doesn't know the acronym of SME, what is that?
Small and medium-sized enterprise.
Okay, small and medium-sized enterprise. Okay, good. All right, thank you very much. So let me go back to you, James. So when you consult on projects for your clients, I don't want to go into the technical details, but what is the kind of low-hanging fruits that you recommend to those building owners to consider in terms of greater impact on energy efficiency with high return on investment?
So I guess typically the first things we look at, and this was highlighted for residential buildings as well, is basically heat and cooling. So we see that the major kind of energy usages of large commercial buildings, particularly office buildings, tends to be related to the air handling units, tends to be related to heating and air conditioning. And obviously this is very climate dependent as well. So for example, a building in Singapore, for example, where it's basically a tropical climate all year round, has a very different energy requirement needs in terms of having to run air conditioning all the time, compared to, say, a country like the UK or like Korea, which actually has some periods of the year where you really don't need any heating or cooling at all, some periods of the year where you need substantial heating, and some periods of the year where you need potentially substantial cooling, particularly in the case of Korea. And so that means that, depending on the geographic location of your building, it can be quite different. But ultimately, the key components come down to improving the efficiency of heating and cooling systems. So that those are the number one. And then, of course, there are other kind of building systems, things like the lifts, the elevators, lighting. So I mean, these kind of systems are obviously large systems that run throughout the building and kind of key for reducing energy demand. But we also see that even at a relatively small scale, and one of the unfortunate things with say skyscraper type buildings, very small footprint tall buildings,
right,
is they don't really have a large amount of kind of rooftop space to put solar panels.
Yes.
However, even with only a small amount of space to put solar panels, it usually still makes economic, even if that only accounts for 1% of the building's energy usage, it usually still makes economic sense to install those solar panels on the roof.
Sure. And
save that 1% of energy usage, because the payback on that is usually pretty quick. So, and obviously, if you have an industrial asset with a very large rooftop space, then actually the payback period is actually pretty short. So usually when we're looking at buildings, we look at those kind of a few big energy demand or consumption items, particularly to do with heating and cooling. And then we also look at what options there are for generation installed on the building itself.
Thank you. Well, no, unfortunately, we don't have any audience who can ask us questions today, so there's no Q&A session. But however, I'd like to wrap up this discussion from you, James. So, if you can advise a couple of things to the design professionals or consultants in South Korea to achieve this carbon neutrality in building sectors, what would be your advice or recommendations to them?
Ooh, that's
This was, by the way, this wasn't coordinated, so it's surprised.
This is a really tough question. So I actually think that our role as consultants is to educate, right? We need to show, we need to communicate what's going to happen in the future. So I think as consultants, we are pretty well educated about the journey that we need to go on to achieve net zero and to be on this 1.5 degree pathway. And I think we're much more educated about that than asset owners and asset developers are.
Mm-hmm.
So our role is to understand what that decarbonisation pathway means so that we can prepare asset owners and asset developers to be able to meet that. Because effectively what we want to avoid which is becoming increasingly likely, is stranded assets, right? So for any large asset portfolio owner, if they don't start making large investments in improving energy efficiency now, there's a good chance, if the rest of the industry does, that they are suddenly going to find that they have a very expensive, very high emitting asset where they no longer have the revenue coming from that building to allow them to make incremental upgrades over time. And so basically they end up with an asset which is very high emissions, has very low revenue coming from tenants because tenants don't want to be in a dirty building. Yeah. And so there's no stream of income to invest in the upgrades. So our job as consultants is to prepare the asset owners for that journey, to show them this is the risk, and in order to avoid that risk, this is the pathway of improvements that we need to make over time to realise this 1.5 degree future, which is ultimately where the whole building industry globally is going.
Okay, well, thanks for that advice. So again, if you're an architect or engineer or consultant out there, then please make sure that you are educated first yourself, so you can educate your clients and asset owners. That's great advice. So, John, from your government perspective again, what would be your advice to the regulation legislators and government officials in South Korea in terms of how you've been enforcing your regulations in your country?
Thanks, Brian. So, the UK has been tackling emissions probably in a way which some other nations haven't been for quite a long time. This is very kind of embedded in the UK ethos. We're very committed to 2050 net zero. Actually, if you ask many people in the UK population, there's actually more than 50% who would like to go faster. So what I would suggest is the destination of travel for 2050 net zero is set. It is set in the UK, it's set in Korea through legislation. Now we need to deliver it. I think in the UK, one of the critical things we've had is a genuinely independent advisory body advising the government on the interventions that need to be made in line with the science. That type of infrastructure and architecture is now evolving in Korea, and there's a presidential commission on 2050 carbon neutrality and green growth, which is doing some fantastic work in this space. I think my sense from speaking to contacts around Korea is the first kind of challenge of measuring the scale of the problem has been done. I think there's the understanding of the life cycle emissions, the understanding of the problems, the pain points in the kind of Korean sector and how we get to net zero is pretty clear. Now we need to start really fleshing out really detailed, full-length strategies in order to deliver it. There is not a one-size-fits-all kind of approach here. The UK has taken an approach of let's make really stretching targets, whether it was for phasing out coal in 2024, whether it's phasing out the petrol and diesel engine by 2030. We think in the UK context that makes a lot of sense because it gives the whole economy absolute clarity on what the direction of travel is. I think those are probably the type of levers we need to see within the building sector. Work from your pain points, work out what you need to do to get there, and start giving the market certainty so that it can respond through investments and it can respond through training of the next generation of skilled engineers and contractors who are going to deliver on this vision. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. So to wrap up this panel discussion, I'd like to thank Mr. Woodland and Hooper for their participation, and it's been a wonderful discussion, and hopefully the audience can get the insight from you and they can deliver that to Korean construction industry. So to wrap up, the Construction Vision Forum and the British Embassy Seoul have collaborated a lot of different things for the past few years, and this is another program that they started, so hopefully they can deliver more to you later on. So please stay tuned. Thank you very much.